What I would suggest is that if before submitting to a journal that you go through some extra steps which will take some time but which will greatly improve the odds that you make it first of all through the first round and then second of all make it into the journals. And these are some steps that are sometimes forgotten but that can be really make the difference between, say, moving on or getting a rejection. What you may want to focus on is first of all to very carefully proofread your document. It's quite disturbing if you find, say, multiple typos in an abstract or an introduction, if only because typically the editor then does not want to send it out to the reviewers because they will get upset, or also because it makes the editor and the reviewers already wonder about the accuracy of the rest of the paper. Say, if you have many typos in your text, how can one trust that the analysis have been done correctly? So what does that mean? That means, for example, consistency in your referencing. Making sure that there is a one-to-one correspondence between the references in the text and the references in the reference list. Making sure that there is a one-to-one correspondence between the numbers that you report in the text and the numbers that you report in the tables. Making sure that your references all have the correct dates, the correct initials, and so forth. So basically a sign that you have been careful in the write-up. Apart from that checking, which should be fairly obvious, that this is important to do, you may also want to work especially hard on the transitions between different paragraphs, so that if two paragraphs follow one another, that it's logical for the reader that one paragraph comes before another paragraph, that one is a consequence of something else, that one leads to something else, and so forth. Third, what you may want to do is to write everything in the active sense, in the sense that this is a much more fluent reading, that you say we show rather than it has been shown, and to do that very consistently. That you consistently use either the past tense or the present tense. Also, that you do your homework before submitting a paper to a particular journal, so that you familiarize yourself with the writing style of that journal. Is that a journal that likes to see many mathematical equations in the paper, or is that a journal that likes to see the mathematical equations put in a technical appendix? Is that a journal that likes to see limitations mentioned in the main text, or is that a journal that typically does not have a limitation section? So basically we are in marketing. The message is get to know your target audience, get to know the target journal, and adjust your writing to that particular journal. Other issues that you may want to pay attention to is, and that's clearly the most important thing, is to make sure that you clearly indicate in the introduction the contribution that you're going to make. The introduction is one of the most critical pieces in the paper, so try to convince the reader after he or she went through the introduction that your paper is worthwhile reading. So clearly indicate how your paper differs from existing literature. However, the fact that something has not been done is not a sufficient condition for publication. You also must be able to show that your paper, or that you're studying a relevant and important problem. Because there are many things that have not been done yet. There are many things that have not been described in the journals, but maybe the question should be asked whether or not there's a reason why it has not been done yet. Maybe it's just not interesting, maybe it's just not relevant. So think about, one, how does your work differ from existing work? And two, why would we care about an answer to that particular question? What do you put in an introduction? So the contribution, why it's relevant, maybe also a preview of the results, so that the reader knows, are those results very obvious, or are there certain surprising results that may warrant further thought? And if you then mention some preliminary, some or give a preview of the results, maybe you want to focus on the non-obvious ones, because that will trigger some curiosity on the part of the reader to continue reading. Following that introduction, you come to the lit review. What I would highly suggest there, especially if it's the first paper following your dissertation, is to not go overboard with that literature review. And yes, I know that's typically the more easy part to write. You're also the world's leading expert on that particular topic, and in your dissertation you have read everything that is to be read about that topic. But think about whether you really need 5 references to make a particular point. Maybe 2 references is enough. Also, do you need references to state the obvious? Like, do you need 5 references to support the idea that brand loyalty is a good asset to have? So think, where do I need references and which references do I want to give there? In doing so, please keep in mind that not every reference is equally important. Maybe if you have some highly cited papers that make a certain point that's more influential than that someone in an obscure journal have ever made some comment dealing with that particular issue. So keep the number of references to a limit, but also give those references where they are most useful. Third, if you start to another advice, if you start to write a conceptual framework, maybe it's not that useful to overemphasize the obvious. So suppose that the real contribution of your work is in moderating hypothesis. Then maybe if the main effects hypothesis have already been tested repeatedly, you don't have to spend 10 pages of your paper to go over all the arguments once more to come to the same obvious conclusion that has been tested already several times. Why not openly admit that this is common knowledge, but that your big contribution will be that you develop a contingency framework? So basically it's trying to make sure that the reviewer does not get the impression that what you are discussing is either overly obvious or has been demonstrated already over and over again. Yes, those things may be important, because to test the moderating hypothesis you also need the main effects, but maybe you should not emphasize that and not try to sell that as yet another contribution if everyone already knows that this has been tested before. These are just a couple of simple suggestions that may help to get a better impression of with the reviewers in terms of the extent of the contribution. What you may also want to try to avoid is if you get to the conclusion section that you basically repeat just exactly the same thing that you already said in the abstract, that you said in the introduction, that you said in the hypothesis development, that you said in the empirical results. By that time the reviewer will already know that this effect is significant and the other effect was not significant. Maybe you may want to broaden the discussion a bit and focus more on who should change his or her behavior because of your findings. Focus on the focus on the surprising findings, not on the more obvious ones. Maybe it's okay, but check that with the journal, to also be a bit speculative about that. So basically the idea is to make the whole paper as interesting as possible. And the final advice that may be useful in this respect is to limit the number of pages that you need for your paper to a reasonable level. You may want to think, do I really need 50 pages of text to get the points across that I want to make? Or will perhaps 15 pages or 20 or 25 pages already suffice? What you see is that more and more journals are imposing page limits, and that's for good reason, because papers that are short are typically handled faster in the review process and typically are better able to keep the interest of the review team. I think if you just take these, what I would call more stylistic things into mind, that the odds of being successful are already improved considerably.